The material I'm about to present to you here is not necessarily what I usually present here, but it's a topic I've been looking into related to future writing projects, and it has a lot to do with the region in which I live and which I write about a lot. So if you think you'll find it that interesting, then stick around and I'll give you a crash course on a portion of Appalachian history, the mindsets, the folkways that gave rise to this violence. But if you're here purely for horror and dark fantasy, then maybe catch the next one. I should have at least rereading of an older horror story out within the next couple weeks. So, thanks.
The story I'll be telling you today is principally about the Howards and the Turners, two families in Harlan County, Kentucky, and their feud with one another. But for the story to carry the weight that it should, it needs a little bit of cultural context and period context. And I'm going to set out to do that in as brief a way as is possible, though I will probably fail to be brief because I am a congenital talker. But to understand why this level of violence would not only occur, but be tolerated within the confines of this period and this region especially, you need to have an insight into who these people were, who came into Appalachia. And the answer to that question is a lot of people, Germans, Anglo-Saxons, you name it, but a few French Huguenots, but principally it was the Scots-Irish, or Scotch-Irish, or Ulster-Irish, whatever you'd like to call them. These people, genetically speaking, were from the Scottish lowlands and northern England, predominantly. These people had come into Northern Ireland as sort of settlers of Northern Ireland, of Ulster. Protestants, principally, as opposed to the Catholics of Southern Ireland, a division which still exists today. When you think of the Ulster Scots, the Scots-Irish, you think of clannishness, of insular, communitarian, highly involved with their local area, with their village, their community, their town, but not incredibly trustworthy of outsiders. There's many reasons this could have been. Back in the old country, in Britain and Ireland, they had had problems with first the English and then the Irish. When they were lowland Scots, they'd been fighting the English, and when they were in Northern Ireland, the native Irish were up in arms against them. So it's easy to see why, even from the earliest days of their arrival in the United States, these populations tended to be anti-authority. They tended to be very distrusting of legal systems, governments. I suppose it could be said that any European who would leave Europe for America was a little bit anti-authority. On the one hand, to list the positive, Europeans leaving Europe are brave, they're conquerors, they're pioneers in the truest sense of that word. They're coming into a savage wilderness where life is going to be potentially much more difficult than it is back home. They're going into not just unfamiliar land, but unfamiliar cultural milieus. They are smart enough to plan ahead, to think that generations down the line owning more land and having more prosperity might benefit grandchildren, great-grandchildren. But on the negative side, to list the drawbacks, and there are many, these are people that probably don't have a lot of connection to their homelands, maybe criminals, maybe the poor, the destitute who have been shirked by family. You imagine that many of these people leaving a place like England are abandoning grave sites and hometowns and homesteads and plots of land to which their families have been attached, in some cases for 1,000 and more years. So there's a great deal of iconoclasm and clash with the past that has to have occurred for these people to have left. But the Ulster Irish take this a step further. They are outcasts even among these outcasts. They don't come principally as aristocrats. They don't come with fortunes. A lot of them come as indentured servants. And they bring with them this phenomenal, as I say, anti-authority streak. And moreover, they just like to fight. These are clannish people that are used to fighting border conflicts and having bandits. I mean, if you're talking the lower highlands of Scotland, banditry and farm thefts, the stealing of livestock. They're used to having to protect what they have. So, in a way, these are the ideal people to send into a rugged mountain range, Appalachia, the first frontier of the United States. I suppose the coast is technically the first frontier, but if we're going to use the mimetic of history, the first hard, difficult frontier America faces, the settlers coming in face. These are the men that are going to go in and brave the dangers, and there are many. Not just to start with animals, back in the 1800s and prior, mountain lions still existed in this mountain range. The fauna on its own, just the animals in the woods, made this a dangerous environment. It's livestock, all these other things would have been much more difficult to protect in an era where a mountain lion was roaming the hills. But the natives also played a role. Now, the natives in the region were not nearly so brutal as, say, southwestern natives in the vein of the Comanche, but especially in the early days, the late 1700s and early 1800s, native raids still posed a significant threat to you if you were a European coming across the hills into early Appalachia. So with Appalachians, you're dealing with a group of people who are already used to solving their problems on their own, by their own volition, sword in hand, as it were, who are brought into an environment where relying on yourself and being your own justice and being your own defense system is required early on in the history of the region. And as time marches on, as the 1800s roll on, you find that despite the fact that institutions and courthouses and proper town governments, if we're going to say they're proper, quote unquote, these things roll into the region, but the locals not just don't adapt to them, but they are suspicious of them in many cases. And as this story, the Harlan County feud, will show, maybe they had a right to be suspicious of these institutions. Often they were corrupt and in the favor of an early family or a wealthy family from a given area. So Appalachians of this era are, you might say, almost culturally rebellious. They are culturally prone to contests, to disputes, to arguing, to fighting, to feuding. And they did not have a great deal of respect necessarily for the law. As long as justice, in their view, was being done, they didn't especially care whether or not it was being done by the letter of the law. This wasn't even just a personal thing on a civilian level. This reflected into the government when it was staffed or filled or elected from the ranks of these people. And to give you a solid idea of what I mean when I say this, how deep this went, I'm going to read to you some instructions given to a grand jury by a Letcher County Circuit Court judge, and this was as late as 1904. So this is late in the game, after most of these feuds have taken place, when the frontier has moved far to the west, and you would be justified in assuming that these people would be in the process of being tamed. But these personality traits, I mean, as anybody that's from here or has lived here for any amount of time could tell you, not only were still around in 1904, but to a certain degree are still around to this day. But anyhow, this judge from Letcher County says to his grand jury, quote, "If a civil citizen kills another citizen and it is clear in self-defense, don't indict him. If a civil citizen kills an outlaw, don't indict him, no matter whether he killed in self-defense or not. If one outlaw kills another outlaw, indict him without questioning the motive for killing. In such a case, it would be well to sentence the outlaw for life, and so get rid of him as well as the victim. If a civil citizen takes a bag of provisions on his back and pursues an outlaw all week, and then kills him as he would wild game, don't indict him. If you want to do anything, give him a better gun and more ammunition, so that he can get the next outlaw more easily. If you do indict such a man, be sure that I will file the indictment away as soon as I reach it." End quote. It wouldn't be accurate to say, as many have said, that these were people who were lawless. They had laws, but the laws were principally honor codes. They were familial. They were in the true frontier's sense of the word. Self-set. You were the judge of your own character, and your community was the sounding board for that judgment. You created your own character via your actions. And these people, as I say, perhaps justifiably in most cases, did not trust their courts or their institutions. Now, you shouldn't take all this to be me insulting or demeaning Appalachians somehow. Being tenacious and willing to defend oneself is not, to me, an innately negative trait. Even trees in a woodland, if a sapling rears up next to them, will often throw out a limb slowly over weeks or months to drown that sapling of light and prevent it from encroaching upon its space in the forest canopy, and therefore competing with it. Violence and struggle are an innate part of any existence at any level on Earth, and always have been and always will be. So it shouldn't be taken as an indictment, what I'm saying. If anything, it's a testament to the virility and strength of this people. But it also isn't everything there is to them. They are an incredibly hospitable people, probably for the same reasons. Having to rely on themselves and be insular and self-reliant makes them incredibly familial and jovial and helpful. Growing up on the fringe of Appalachia, I have countless experiences of strangers going out of their way to help you, for no reason other than that you've presented yourself to them. Or simply be kind in passing, very talkative, very willing to share anything about their day-to-day existence with you. Even in very mundane circumstances. I once worked produce at a Kroger, and I'd often get dragged into working the front counter, the front register, when no one was working, when we were short on hands at checkout. And not a week passed where 10 or 20 old women didn't stop the whole line of traffic through the register to have a 5-minute conversation with you about how their cat was doing, which inevitably ended in inviting you to church. A very sweet, affable people. And the same is true, as I say, of helpfulness. Yeah, I had only just moved out into the area where I live now, more of the interior of eastern Kentucky versus the fringe of Appalachia and south central Kentucky, where I grew up, where I came into adulthood. I've now moved deeper into the eastern portion of the state. And not a few weeks after I'd shown up, there was a bad flood in my area, and one of the roads which I traditionally used to go back home during the weekends visiting parents had flooded. And I was pulled over on the side of the road, just shut up in the car, with the phone out, trying to find a way around this closed road. And this older couple were driving along the road and pulled over in front of me. And the old woman gets out and says, "Where are you headed?" And I tell her, and I was like, "I don't know exactly which way to go." And she says, "Well, I'm not headed that way, but follow me," and proceeds to spend 28 minutes weaving her way with me behind her through these back trail, lane and a half, shoddy roads to get around to the town that I needed to go through to get home. So, that happens elsewhere, certainly, but it's incredibly pronounced here. So that propensity for tenacity, for pugnaciousness, for biliousness, for the willingness to fight, is juxtaposed with a very familial nature that is, I seldom encounter it anywhere else. So that gives you an idea of the mindset in which my region existed, especially during that period of time. Perhaps just as important, though, is the landscape itself, because I believe it played a huge part in reinforcing those already extant elements in the Appalachian personality. The landscape isolates different communities from one another and is in some places hard to traverse. I imagine, like the Highlands of Scotland, it lent itself to forming close familial and clan bonds within a certain geographic area, and not sharing those with somebody who maybe came from only 50 miles away. If you've never been in the area, the mountains are not as tall, obviously, as the Rocky Mountains out west, but they are very treacherous in certain ways. I like to talk in my fiction about how thick the forest grows, that it's almost jungle-like. I mean, as somebody that's tromped through jungles on Borneo and Sulawesi, I would hazard to say that it would struggle to be as thick as certain areas of Appalachian woodland, especially on the lower slopes, can get in the height of summer when it's a wet, humid summer. It's a hard place to see anything at the right time of year far away from you. The crags and creeks that carve different portions out of a ridge face create very sudden drops and very easily missed crags and overhangs in the rock. And this not only made it easy for communities to be isolated from one another, for different accents and different familial identities to exist right next door to one another, but it also allowed the feuds to be incredibly long-lasting and vicious. There's a story by Robert E. Howard, the fantastic fantasy writer, who also worked in the field of Westerns. Being a Texan, he tends to write about Texan gunfighters and such. And in this Western that Robert E. Howard wrote, there's a couple men fighting out the end of a feud. It's only about a 5-page story, so very brief, very bloody. And he makes the overture in that story that a Western feud or a Western gunfight was more brutal than an Eastern gunfight because the terrain was not as claustrophobic. The terrain was open and it forced you to finish each other off immediately. But I would argue, not to contest a great writer, but I would argue that it's almost more brutal to be restricted, to be in a confined space like that. Anybody that's ever been in a war zone knows that the waiting is the most taxing part of any conflict mentally. It's the waiting. Say you're a soldier in Iraq at some kind of FOB, and you're waiting for weeks every single day, knowing that a stray bang could herald a sniper's bullet taking your throat out. The exact same tension exists for a feudist in Appalachia. Some of these feuds will last many years, and you have to imagine that the members of these families or these groups, these allied families that are living under the pall of that potential violence, they're getting water from a well every day. They're going to town, maybe going to Sunday meeting, riding a mule to a church, getting pigs out of a pen. And every moment of every day, they have an impenetrably thick wood line next to their property. They have ridges that they're passing under to get into town. They have crevices, overhangs, rocky perches that they're going beneath to get through a holler into a wider stretch of road. And if they know that they are in a kind of active, open gun range situation with another family in the community, every minute spent in that environment is spent worrying about when the next bang is going to go off, when the next gunshot's going to get heard. And constantly in these stories, Harlan included, you're going to run into ambushes or attempted ambushes, these fights that probably one party had no grasp of the fact that it was even a fight until it began. That's a huge element of these pitched battles between families, is that they often weren't pitched battles. This feud starts with a battle in town, a kind of high noon shootout, but devolves very quickly into a great many ambushes and shootouts where one party is entirely holed up in a house. It's very difficult to think of this in the same way that you would think about Old West shootouts. These were long, drawn-out, bloody, tense affairs where people would spend significant portions of their lives worried about when that life might end. Now, having rambled more than enough, I'll actually do you the solid of getting on to the actual feud. Now, the Harlan County feud was between the Turners and the Howards. Now, Harlan County will, to most people, be familiar because of coal demonstrations, pro-union songs and such from the early 1900s mention Harlan County a lot. A great deal of the coal wars, the miner wars and such, was fought in and around this area. So it's probably more famed for that outside of the state, and even inside the state to a great degree. But in the 1880s, where the majority of this story is going to take place, coal was not really being mined yet. The business of the area was still principally small-scale farming. Hogs did especially well on inclines, and lumber. Mining was practiced, but not nearly as a staple economic pastime as it would later become. And so both of the families involved in this story are not miners, but the Howards and the Turners are early settlers. They end up coming in right at the turn of the 1800s. In those earliest days, the town had not yet been named Harlan, and it was called Mount Pleasant. Both families ended up acquiring a fair bit of wealth and land, and over the course of the 1800s, they built up little business ventures and such for themselves in the town. The Harlan County Courthouse, for example, was built on land purchased by the county from the Howards. As for the character of the families, it must be said that while the Howards would certainly play their part in the violence and commit their share of the killings, in fact, probably kill more in the long run than the Turners, the Turners are hard to root for. The feud probably would not have started without the instigation of the Turners, and the Turners, even far before the feud, had a fairly vicious criminal streak in them. One especially, Devil Jim Turner, though he doesn't play a direct role in this story, plays an indirect role because it's part of the early tensions between the family come from the fact that the Howards and people allied to them in town had petitioned for Devil Jim to go to prison, which ended up happening. So the Turners saw the Howards and people allied to the Howards as being partially responsible for his jailing for murder. But Devil Jim had supposedly been prone to some pretty vicious acts. This man was supposed to have stricken and raped his own aunt after an altercation with her. He enlisted for the Union during the Civil War, but deserted pretty quickly and became a bandit in both Harlan County and Lee County, Virginia, and capitalized in that by causing chaos and livestock rustling and all kinds of things on the border region between the two states. So this was a fairly dastardly man, and the family itself seems to have been, while not entirely criminal, prone to brigandish behavior. There was a rival hotel and store opened up in town, and the Turners, who owned a store, supposedly threatened the store owner to the point that he felt he needed to leave, and he ended up in Indiana. It's also said that in childhood, one of the main players on the Howard side, Wills Howard, the principal gunman on their side of the feud, had been assaulted by Turners and Cawwoods, Cawwoods being a family that was closely in league with the Turners during this feud. And the Cawwoods had held him while the Turners beat him. So there was seemingly a long history of family clashes prior to any of this kicking off. Now, some would claim, in fact most seem to claim, that this starts over a shooting. Wicks Howard and Little Bob Turner had been both involved in a poker game, and they were upset over either cheating or an event involving setting fire to one of the players' hair. And this fight evolved into a street shootout the next day, when they met up and Bob shot Wicks in the arm and Wicks shot him with a shotgun. His arm was injured and he just one-handed blasted this man in the chest with a shotgun, killed him. But this doesn't seem to have been the straw that broke the camel's back. While I'm sure Turners were upset about this didn't spark the proper feud. Little George Turner, the son of the patriarch of the Turner family and a friend, went to the Howard store in town, where Hiram and Alice Howard, who were the principal matriarch and patriarch of the Howard family, made and sold whiskey. Little George's father, George Sr., was known to be a drunk, and apparently Little George was coming to demand that Alice at the counter stop selling his father whiskey, that she cut him off permanently. Alice would not take this, and she begins an argument, saying that they should tell George not to drink if they don't want him to drink, and apparently little George spoke roughly to Alice Howard. Now, Wilson Howard, usually called Wills Howard, hearing this, didn't take it too well. And about a week later, on the road to Hagen, Virginia, Wills ends up running into Will Turner, one of the Turner boys, and reportedly a tough guy. So they get into a verbal altercation on the road, passing one another. A shooting kicks off, but nobody is injured in the shootout. They both flee. Wills Howard gets home, and paranoid about there being a Turner counterattack, he gets the family ready for one, and sure enough, that night, the Howard house is fired on. A gunfight ensues, and though no one is killed in the gunfight, Will Turner, who's leading the attack on the Howard house, is wounded. He ends up leaving for the West to recuperate soon after, kind of getting out of town. This is all taking place in 1887, and as late summer rolls on and tensions start rising in town, the brother of Alice Howard, Will Jennings, is written to by Alice and Wills and is convinced to come home to help out, to help secure the family. Will Turner ends up coming home soon afterwards, and not long after that, George Turner, the patriarch of the Turners, writes a letter to the Howards, which is effectively a challenge to a duel. He says Will, the bulldog, the quote bulldog, unquote, of the Turners has returned home, and he would like to engage in an open battle at the Harlan County Courthouse. Now, the reason why the Turners felt bold enough to challenge them to a gunfight in the middle of town is likely because Wilson Lewis, who was kin to both the Turner and Cawood families, was the county judge of Harlan County. Moreover, a Turner, Moses Turner, was sheriff of Harlan. So perhaps they felt that they had the deck stacked in their favor, and they did in the grand scheme of things. But it also had to do with Mrs. George Turner, the matriarch of the Turner clan, who supposedly replied to a third party who was trying to negotiate a ceasefire or truce between the two families in the run-up to this shootout, that she would, quote, rather have my boys brought home on blankets, end quote. And she also said, quote, my boys will never lay down their arms, end quote. Now, there was a momentary truce despite her protest, but a couple of the Turners, Little George and Carlo Turner, were not party to that truce, and Wills didn't believe that they would hold up their end of the bargain, and it turns out he was right. Just as they were riding home, as the Howards were riding home from this truce meeting, someone fired on them from the roadside. They flee and no one gets hurt, but afterwards Wills swears that he is going to wipe the Turners out with or without a truce. So the Howards decide to take the Turners up on the challenge. It's worth noting that relatively few Howards actually signed on to the venture. It was principally Wills and other men like Will Jennings in the camp of the Howards that were invested in the violence. The vast majority of the Howards, numerically speaking, seem to have wanted to stay out of it. James Howard was among the ones that signed on. He was Wils's older brother, and he sent word back to George Turner that they would meet at the listed day on the letter at the courthouse. Now, for whatever reason, you would assume that the men who issued the challenge would be the ones that were lying in wait. They would be the prepared ones. After all, it's the Turners that have control of the apparatus of the town. They have the county judge and the sheriff in their pockets. As you'll see later in the story, these institutions are wholly on their side. But despite this, they don't seem to actually be ready. And right around dawn, when the Howard faction, the Howard and Jennings faction, rides into town, they end up going into taking up positions both in the courthouse and across the street from the courthouse. So they have this crossfire set up across a street of the town of Harlan. The Turner house, the Turner mansion as it was called, was right in the middle of Harlan, near the courthouse. And after breakfast, the Turners, about a dozen of them, walk out of the Turner mansion down the road, and they've almost reached the courthouse when someone spots the Howards, and everybody starts shooting. Now, it's amazing to me, but only one person was killed in the shootout that you would assume, because of the double-sided, almost ambush that the Turners are in, that more people would have been shot. But a lot of people are winged, wounded in minor ways, but it ends up being the bulldog himself, Will Turner, who is the only one to actually die, principally because he attempts to charge the front door of the courthouse. He's hit as he goes up towards the courthouse. He kind of falls, he gets up, he's retreating. He's hit again. He has to be helped up by others. But his second hit had been in the stomach. And by the time he retreats back to the front porch of the Turner mansion, he's screaming in pain. He's bleeding profusely. He's clearly dying. And Mrs. George Turner, the matriarch of the Turner family, who had insisted on the fight in opposition to the truce to begin with, shows that she's a pretty based, a pretty vicious animal here. She says to her dying son, quote, "Stop that. Die like a man, like your brother did," end quote. And Will did die. Will died there on the porch. But Will's getting winged so early probably saved most of the Turners, because it was him getting wounded that ended up making them all retreat to the house. And once they had retreated, the Howards and their associated Jennings, Hezekiah and such, Jennings, ended up congealing on the street for a little while, hanging out, having a smoke, talking, and when they realized that everything was over, they rounded up and headed home. Now, in the aftermath of this, the mother of Will Jennings calls, who is, as I say, allied with the Howards, calls on Mrs. George Turner, the matriarch of the Turners, and kind of, I suppose, tries to strike a matronly peace between the two families. Enough blood has been shed, or what have you. And again, Mrs. George Turner hits her with the rip-roaring quotes here. She points to apparently Jennings has come to see her at her house, and she points to the spot on the porch where her son bled out. And she says, quote, "You can't wipe out that blood. Either the Turners will rule or the Howards, but not both," end quote. This whole time, as she's delivering these fire and brimstone quotes, the judge, Lewis, their intermarried relative of the Cawwoods and the Turners, is writing letters to the governor of Kentucky, selling this as a kind of insurrection by the Howards, that the Howards are outlaws and bandits, and they're rip-roaring thieves riding slipshod across the countryside. In fact, he says directly of Mrs. George Turner that she is, she's a grieving mother and wants only peace, and the fighting is dragging on anyhow. And cyclically, as this contest goes on, the sheriff is going to continue to write these pleading letters to the governor, off in the capital, begging for aid to be sent in to help crush the Howards. Now, the next encounter doesn't happen for a few weeks, but it turns out someone tells Wills that little George Turner has been following him, trailing him as he moves around. Learning this, Wills supposedly decides that he's going to trail little George. So regardless of who started trailing who, these people are kind of seeking each other out. The showdown is debated to a certain extent, the principal bone of contention being whether or not a mule was stolen by Wills Howard to overtake little George Turner on the road. That was reported, but it's also evident that after the fight, an injured Wills would take a horse or a mule from a preacher to get away because he had a wounded leg and he couldn't walk, or at least not walk well. So it's unclear whether or not the detail of the stolen mule / horse is a fabrication of the judge in town, because if Wills has stolen a mule or a horse beforehand rather than afterward, from a preacher because he's wounded, it makes it look as if he's, actively hunting this guy down. But you do need to be careful with the way that the whole chain of events is reported by authorities, because most of the authorities are allied to the Turners, and the Turners have a history of playing dirty with businesses in the town. So to a certain degree, it's hard to buy that this was entirely that Wills was playing predator or what have you. But regardless, he'd certainly had a hot streak, so that's possible. But whatever the case may be, Wills ended up coming upon George while he was drinking from a stream along this road. They have a shootout. George rolls behind a boulder near this spring or stream. They both empty their guns at one another until Wills realizes that his opponent is not shooting back. And he realizes that even though he's been wounded in the thigh, fairly badly, but not fatally, he shot his opponent 4 times. One of the bullets having almost taken the top of his head off. So George is killed in this shootout, but Wills doesn't seem to have been highly worried about it because in his opinion it was self-defense. So, but the preacher who he seems to have taken a mount from to escape the scene ends up going into town and reporting this shootout having happened. And any idea of a truce being workable after that is pretty much donezo. All this is unfolding on August 4th of 1889. About a month passes, and letters are being fired off to the governor of Kentucky by everybody of importance in town. Most of these local officials in Harlan are relatively neutral. They're not blaming anybody for the violence specifically, they're just decrying the violence itself. But Lewis, true to form, is still painting the Howards as outlaws, as desperados that are kind of reigning via chaos over the town. They are all asking the governor to send troops. Now, Governor Buckner of Kentucky seems to have, from the beginning, been rubbed wrong by Judge Lewis. For whatever reason, he found Judge Lewis to be fishy. Maybe he had some inkling of his overarching connections in that feud and was suspicious of the way he was casting it, but throughout this story, he's going to be hesitant to intervene on Judge Lewis's behalf. Despite his hesitation, the governor does on September 7th of 1889 order about 100 troops into Harlan to specifically protect the courthouse and to defend court proceedings that needed to go on that month. The only way Lewis could wrangle any troops was specifically to prevent violence during a court day. And after that court day was over, the troops departed. They had no part, or Buckner wanted the troops, the state, to have no part in wrangling half of this feud up. He seemed to have wanted the local authorities to handle their own problems. But the troops would end up leaving in October after court business had been concluded. And not long after that, on October 11th, John Cawood was shot and killed from ambush, right near home just a few miles outside of town. And another man, Hezekiah Hall, who was a friend of the family, the Cawood family, was also killed in this ambush. Just a few miles up the road from that, Hiram Cawood was shot not a few minutes later and ended up dying the next day of his wounds. Soon after that, Stephen Cawood was also fired at, a mile below the Cawood farm, but escaped, and rode into town and reported all of the killings. Now, when Stephen Cawood rode into town, he said that he had seen Wills Howard and Will Jennings in the area, with 20 or so of what he described as outlaws. Now, the blame for this is still relatively vague. Wills and other Howard allied fighters in this feud have never admitted to the killing of the Cawwoods. However, for so many to have been killed in ambush on the same day in the same area during the course of this feud, it seems, and because of their fierce ties with the Turners and the fact that they'd been involved in a lot of these fights up to this point, it's hard to imagine this was all just coincidence and not part of the feud. But regardless of who ended up doing it, a lot of Cawwoods were dead, and now Judge Lewis finally had a reason. He had a kind of third party, an allied family, but still another family who had suffered large losses, and he would use this as ammunition in his letters to the governor. In these letters, where Judge Lewis is pleading for Buckner to send back the troops, he claims that Wills Howard and Will Jennings and their band of outlaws, 20 or 25, depending on which figure you're believing, are sending word from the hills to the good citizens of Harlan that they would do well to get out of town because they may or may not burn down the town. Now, again, because of Lewis's Turner slant, it's difficult to believe wholeheartedly this. There's no record of them having threatened to burn down the town, but he's claiming that they're issuing threats to burn down the town. This is where Governor Buckner of Kentucky, starts to dig in his heels, and this is going to be his stance throughout most of the rest of the feud. Lewis wants him to send in troops, as he did before, specifically to round up the Howards, to get them in particular. Buckner pretty much tells Lewis that if they're such a terror to the community, if they're terrorizing the county, if they're really a band of 25 brigands and outlaws, then you have more than enough armed men in the county to raise a posse of 100, 200, 300 men and go and take them. So you don't need troops sent by me. If the community is really disturbed by this, if this isn't just an internecine family conflict in town, and it's actually banditry, then you have more than enough people to go in and solve this problem yourself. And the aftermath of this goes to show how disinterested or unthreatened the community was by the feud, and specifically how perhaps they sympathized to a great degree with the Howards, because even though Lewis was authorized to raise a posse of 100 men, the largest figure we can come by to the amount of volunteers he got was 60, and the actual number, based on the records of genealogists and local historians and a letter later sent by Wills Howard to the governor, seems to have been closer to 9. So Judge Lewis, with all of his authority, could only raise a grand total of 9 guys to go and round up the Howards, which doesn't sound like the volunteer apparatus you'd build if the whole community were petrified of roving bandits in the hills. So anyhow, though, perhaps foolishly, the judge takes these 9 men to the Howard stronghold, to their house. The posse demands that the Howards inside surrender, and they refuse. A gunfight breaks out, but the details of this gunfight are fairly hazy. Lewis seems to have retreated to town and fortified the courthouse in the wake of this fight, implying that he was worried about a counterattack from the Howards. But in a letter to the governor, he says, quote, "We proceeded upon them in their stronghold. They, refusing to surrender, were fired upon by our posse, we wounding 8, all making their escape with Howard and Jennings, but 3 of the most serious wounded. Howard and Jennings are now organizing over 100 desperadoes to get revenge." End quote. There's a lot of details about that don't really add up. The 3 wounded men that the Howards supposedly had to leave behind after this shootout were never arrested. There's no records of them being arrested, and Lewis never mentions it being such. Moreover, if the Howards had left in fear, if they'd retreated from this fight, kind of whipped after the gunfight, then why would Lewis have felt so threatened that he immediately fled back to town and fortified it as if there was about to be a siege? Some accounts of this of Lewis's probable posse of 9 put the dead of that posse of 9 at 6 and 3 wounded. Most others say 3 were killed and 3 were wounded. Whatever the case may be, in the wake of this humiliation at the hands of the Howards, Lewis goes back to town, writes again to Governor Buckner, asks again for troops to be sent specifically to do what he calls impartial enforcement of the law, but really in his mind that means rounding up and locking up the Howards. And Buckner, still smelling a little bit of bullshit on the wind, again tells him that he's got plenty of citizens available to him. If the community has a problem with these people, then you should be able to get together enough men to corral them. And that statement seems even more tenable, because despite all of Judge Lewis's contention that there are 20 or more men involved in a lot of these fights on the Howard side, it really seems to have been principally Wills Howard and Will Jennings that are doing most of the fighting on the Howard side, with other people involved. For instance, later on, Wills would say that in this shootout that's just occurred, a young boy who was a friend of their family's, Bud Spurlock, was injured during this shootout, which implies that there was at least this other young boy present in their company during this fight. But it's difficult to know whose figures are accurate. But even though the governor seems to have been fairly neutral, from Wils's point of view, he's growing more and more paranoid because the whole apparatus of the town is in control of the Turners and their allies. And he feels like if he doesn't kill all of these Turners and allies, they're going to kill him and his family more broadly. Given that he is kind of the lightning rod, the focus for the anger of the Turners, Wills decides, along with Will Jennings, that they're going to skip town. They're going to go out west. They're going to go on the run for a while and hopefully come back when things have settled down. And then maybe then a truce can be negotiated or something can be done. Now the Turners get word of this, and some of the Turners end up going to Hiram Howard's house and trying to threaten the Howards into leaving with their kin who are going out west to just all leave the county. Alice is the only one that seems to have been home during this altercation, and she threatens the Turners with a rifle and tells them to get off her property. After they're gone, she ends up riding to where Wills is laying low at a relative's house and tells her about this altercation, and this sends Wills into a rage. He feels as if his family is now under threat, and he can't leave with there being threat posed to the family. So he and Hezekiah Jennings, Will Jennings' father, end up going into town and attacking the Turner house. Either they fired on the house while 16 of the Turner family were having breakfast, or they laid an ambush outside. It's not entirely clear. The ambush story is another Lewis report, and that the town legendary more broadly is that the house was fired on. Regardless of which of these stories is true, whether they just fired on the broad side of the house or waited for people to leave the house or town and shot them in an ambush, family friends of the Turners, the Baileys, were in the group that was fired upon. And one of the Baileys, either Alexander or John Bailey, was killed during this shooting, though it's not very clear which. Alexander was said to be the one at the time, but Wills denied later on that it was Alexander and said it had been John Bailey, not Alexander Bailey. But one of the Baileys, another group of Turner allies in the town, was shot during this altercation. It may well have been that neither of these Baileys were dead yet, and that they were mistaken about having killed anyone during this ambush. But whatever the case may be, they end up going to the house of a lesser judge, Middleton, the next day, in an attempt to surrender their weapons and give themselves in. This being Wills, Will, and a couple of their friends, the Hall boys. Before they even reach Middleton's house, they're ambushed by Pearl Bailey, one of these Bailey's kin, and they kill him during the ambush, even though he gets the drop on them along the roadside. Again, in thick brush, I imagine. He gets a good shot at them from behind a stone, behind cover, misses, and then they dive off the trail in to cover themselves, and to get a better shot, Pearl stands up and ends up getting shot fatally himself. After this debacle on the road, the Hall brothers break off from the group. They lose their nerve and decide that they're not going to end up surrendering. Will seems also to have gone either another way or given up on the idea of surrendering. So it ended up just being Wills alone who approaches this lesser judge's house. As he approaches the judge's house, George Turner, who had been visiting this lesser judge, steps out of the front door. Now, Wills believes George Turner Sr. is armed, so he fires at him, and instead of hitting George, hits a Bailey, probably John Bailey, one of the Baileys that was assumed to have died in the earlier shootout, who actually dies this time, having been hit in the doorway behind George. This skirmish leads to Wills Howard and Will Jennings renewing their resolution to flee west and see the west, to get out of town and let things cool down. They feel they have no other options. And the rip-roaring gallivanting out west that follows casts further aspersions and suspicion on Wills Howard, because he gets into a lot of trouble out west. Even if the rest of the Howard clan were relatively defensive, they were in the right for the most part in the earliest portions of this feud. Wills has been the one that has carried on the vast majority of the violence on the Howard side throughout the whole arc of this story. And after he's gone out west, he's going to be bumbling through whorehouses. He's going to get into a shootout supposedly out west and kill several natives in the shootout. And the most important of the crimes he's supposed to have committed out west is a murder of a mute in Missouri. Wills ended up jumping bail after getting out of prison on bail for this murder and flees back home in March of 1890. In the interim period, while he's been away out west, whoring and gunfighting and such, you can only imagine that back home it's been an intense existence for the Howards he left behind. The whole of this conflagration, this huge fight between these two families, has almost certainly left a piss-poor taste in the mouths of the Turners. And they have to have been fairly overbearing and aggressive towards the Howards in town, given their stranglehold on most of town politics and their strong financial position in town. The stress on people like Alice Howard must have been fairly immense to remain in town while the cloud of Wills being gone but still alive and potentially on the docket to return at any time. It must have been fairly pronounced. The Turners must have been, justifiably to a certain extent, they've been in a shooting war for a great deal of time, on edge, and them being on edge would put the Howards on edge, because even if Wills, the principal shooter, is out of town, the Turners have to know he could show up any day. So Wills, having jumped his bail, ends up coming right back home, being trailed, unbeknownst to him, by a Detective Imbeden from Missouri, who was expecting him, apparently, to flee. Wills gets into town, and so does Imbeden, and Detective Imbeden ends up contacting George Turner Sr. and promising to help him catch Wills Howard. Howard goes home, holds up in the family house, and is immediately contacted by Judge Lewis, who sends him a letter saying it would be better if he left town. Howard does not take kindly to this, and in his response to Lewis, says, "I'm not going to be intimidated in my own home," and threatens broadly to burn the town down. Lewis, in response, contacts the Turners. They arm for battle. Another posse is raised. This posse again goes up into the hills to the Howard home and tried, apparently, to set fire to the home with people inside it, the Turner posse, the Lewis and Turner posse. The Howards spill out. A gunfight ensues. Lewis would say that there were a dozen Howards in the house that come pouring out when it is set fire and engage in a gunfight with them. Wills and the Howards claim that only 3 people, Wills himself, Bud Spurlock, and John Howard, were there in the house. Whatever the case may be, Wills and the other Howards come out of the house. They engage in an open gun battle with a posse that outnumbers them. They kill George Hall, a Turner ally, and Bud Spurlock on the Howard side is wounded in the exchange of gunfire, but the Turners and Judge Lewis end up retreating again. Bob Craig, who was apparently among the Turner posse and who Wills said had been the one to shoot Bud Spurlock, was among the fleeing, and Wills got on a horse and tried to ride him down. He took a shortcut to ride this guy down. He had apparently split off from the rest of the group, this Bob Craig. And so Bob is running across a field. Wills has him at gunpoint as he runs, tells him to disarm and surrender, and he throws down his principal weapon and throws his arms up, but then goes for a pistol after having disarmed, and he's then shot 4 times, or at 4 times, by Wills Howard. I suppose Wills says he only actually hits him 2 or 3 times of those 4, but then a second member of the posse is killed, being Bob Craig. The aftermath was that 2 of Lewis's men had been killed and 5 had been wounded. In the wake of this shootout, Governor Buckner of Kentucky would receive a letter signed by both Wills Howard and Will Jennings. What I'm going to read to you is an abridged rendition of the letter provided in the book Days of Darkness, but it gives you an idea of the mindset that these two men, the whole of the Howard faction really, must have been in at this point in the fighting. Quote, "My dear sir, we see from some of the Louisville papers that you have been asked to send troops up here in the mountains to capture us, and that the papers are full of slush about us being desperados, outlaws and thieves, murderers, cutthroats, and God knows what else. In justice to ourselves and to the thousands of friends in Harlan County and the surrounding counties, we cannot afford to let such outrageous falsehoods go unnoticed. We will not pretend to give you a detailed account of the feud in this county, but it began as far back as the war. There was a crowd of people in this town who wanted to be supreme rulers, and when any stranger would come to town they did not like, they would try to run him off or have him killed, and send many innocent men to their eternal home. We were selected by some unknown power to resist their attacks, and become involved in the feud, and must bear the hardships we now bear, and must sneak around at night like a galley slave scourged to his dungeon. We are as anxious to give up and stand trial as men can be, but that would be like committing suicide, as old Judge Lewis and his crowd of bushwhackers of the, quote, law and order, end quote, party say that if they get us in jail, they intend to burn the jail, and we know they will do it. We will give bail in the amount of $75,000, and can get 3/4 of the people in Harlan County to go on our bond. If we did give bond, we would have to stay hid, and would have somebody to fight all the time. They would try to kill us just as hard then as now. One man can arrest both of us if we are guaranteed protection, but we will never give up to Judge Lewis and his bushwhackers. This is the kind of law and order party the devil has presiding in hell. No one has ever asked us to surrender, and no attempt was ever made to arrest us, but on occasion they have come and fired on us, as they did this time, and then we would fight, and usually whip the hell out of them. Judge Lewis and his crowd slipped up to about 20 yards of where we were and fired on us, hitting one innocent boy by the name of Bird Spurlock, and then fled. Wilson Howard was the only one that fought them, and he whipped the entire 10 bushwhackers. If there had been one man in the party with the least bit of bravery or manhood, he could have killed Howard, as he stood out open and sent the lead flying into them as they ran like cowardly curs they are. With reference to the people in this section, they are quite law-abiding people, are never molesting anyone. As there is a just God, they will have to answer for the unjust assault made on these people, whose only fault is they let us stay amongst them. As to the charges they lay to us in Missouri, we desire to say that if Your Excellency will pardon us for the indictments in Harlan County against us, we assure you that we will come as fast as the first train can carry us. Judging from the papers, you may imagine that we have 40 or 50 men with us. This is not so. We are alone, living as best we can. About 3 weeks ago, Mr. Sam Cash of Clay County, the deputy collector of this district, was sent here on business, and he saw the majority of people in this county, and, if you refer to him, to tell you the sentiment of the people on this feud trouble. In closing, we beg Your Excellency to consider and inquire well into this matter, and you will soon find where the blame lies. Yours to command, Will Jennings, Wilson R. Howard. End quote. The whole time, as usual, Lewis is pestering the governor for troops. And in response to both the Howard letter and the Lewis letters, the governor eventually, on March 17, 1890, sends a company of militia into the county. General Sam Hill is in the lead, and he's kind of there to collect information and come back with a report on the situation. Lewis is at first excited about this, but he then realizes that, as I say, General Sam Hill is there to report, and he's interviewing everybody in town, and he's quickly coming to see that the vast majority of people in town are not so one-sided as he was in his assessment of the violence. Hill ends up meeting with Howard himself about 12 miles outside of town. he tells Wills Howard that he's there not to arrest anybody, but to work out a peace. And Howard supposedly tells him that he would very willingly lay down his arms if he knew he wasn't going to be murdered after having surrendered, and that he'd rather die on his feet than, die in a jail being burned to death or some other such. So General Hill ends up going back into town, talking with Lewis and the Turners, and working out a tentative peace, and then going back to tell Wills about this. Wills promises that he and the Howards would not be the first to break that peace, and the militia ends up dispersing and going home. Now, it's unclear exactly why what's about to happen happened. If this peace had been serious, and the general must have thought it was serious because he and the militia leave right after it's concluded. So, but I assume in the minds of Wills and Will, the shadow of Judge Lewis and the Turners is still hanging over their heads, and the threat is ever present to them. But it doesn't bode well for their historical memory, because it does seem as if they've just promised not to break a truce, and their plan is immediately to break a truce. But as I say, I can't understand why somebody who's been in the thick of this for so long doesn't just trust the goodwill of the other side. In any event, Wills and Will hatch a plot. They're going to trick Lewis into an ambush and hopefully finish him off. They seem to kind of perceive Judge Lewis as being the pinnacle of the trouble in town. They write a letter to Lewis, posing as the county judge of Rogersville, Tennessee. And as this judge, they tell Judge Lewis that they, down in Tennessee, have Will Jennings and Wills Howard in their jail, and they need to confirm who they are so that they can be sent back to Harlan County. So this, of course, excites Judge Lewis. He thinks, oh, we finally got him. And he rounds up a group of men to head down to Tennessee to pick up his prisoners by the main roads. And, of course, Wills and Will are in wait on the main roads, ready to ambush these men as they go south into Tennessee. Now, George Turner Sr. saves Judge Lewis's bacon by smelling bullshit on the wind himself. He says, none of this makes sense. How do we know that this letter was sent by the judge of this county in Tennessee? Why would he not send his own group of men with these prisoners? So he raises stink about how bad this event smells. And he says, look, send your men down to Judge Lewis, but you use alternate longer routes. So Judge Lewis ends up relenting to George Turner, and he sends his men south along a larger route, which winds west out of town, and it takes much longer. And in the process defeats the kind of Hail Mary ambush of Wills Howard and Will Jennings. And, of course, they get to Tennessee. They find out that the judge has no idea who these men are, really, and the letter was a fake. In the wake of their failed ambush, the two of them, Wills and Will, set out west, and they split up after having done so. Will doesn't make it very far. He gets to Missouri before he's arrested and sent back home and ends up getting imprisoned for the murder of John Bailey, which he did not commit. Wills steers clear of Missouri because he's already wanted there for the killing of the deaf mute, and ends up in California. But by the time he gets to California, his money is running low. He is ostensibly also still being trailed by Detective Imbeden from Missouri. His poverty and kind of gallivanting around California lasts on the perimeters of the law out there until about June 1893, when he's caught robbing a Wells Fargo stagecoach in California and sent to prison. Wills was using the name Brown when he was arrested and traveling under the name Brown. Just by a stroke of luck, when he went to prison in California, someone in the prison spotted him from a wanted poster, recognized him off a wanted poster, and Imbeden ended up being called into this prison to identify Wills Howard. And at long last, Wills Howard is sent back to Missouri for the murder of the mute in Missouri. a man named McMichaels. Having now admitted to being Wills Howard, Wills is dragged off to Missouri, and on the stand, he rattles off the names of the men he admits to having killed during the feud. These being Bob Craig, Will Turner, George Hall, and John Bailey. He never mentioned having killed most of the Cawwoods, who were all killed on the same day, and he also never mentioned having killed Hezekiah Hall, casting some doubt on whether or not he was the one to do these things. However, again, given the context of the deaths of the Cawwoods and Hezekiah Hall, it's difficult to believe he wasn't at least involved, if not someone else like Will Jennings being the one to actually fire the killing shots. But in any case, he never admitted to killing McMichaels, the mute from Missouri, and maintained his innocence right up to the gallows. Alice Howard, his mother, and Rebecca, his sister, made the trip out to St. Louis and were with Wills throughout the course of his trial for murder. He was found guilty for the murder of McMichaels and sentenced to death by hanging. And he received, supposedly, this sentence with a great deal of dignity, as reported the St. Louis newspapers. Wills was taken to the train to board and be taken to Lebanon, Missouri, where he was to be executed. He had a tearful goodbye with his mother and with his sister, and on the train would end up meeting Detective Imbeden face to face for the first time. Imbeden says that Wills Howard looked at him pretty coldly, but then returned a shake of the hand after a lot of hesitation. Wills would later say to a cellmate that he had had a knife under his belt, concealed the whole time, with which he had planned to kill Imbeden in the train, but had decided upon seeing the man that he didn't have the heart to kill him. On his last night, Wills would tell a reporter that, quote, "Let me tell you something. I'm not going to die game. I don't believe in this business of bravado, but I will die like a man, and an innocent man. So now, goodbye," end quote. He'd be marched up onto the gallows August 4th of 1894. And when asked for any last words, he's supposed to have replied, quote, "Only that I hope to meet you all in heaven," end quote. And with the death of Wills Howard, the Harlan County feud, the Howard-Turner War, came to an end. Perhaps surprisingly, the tensions born during this feud, the hatred that one would assume brewed up between these two families, seems to have dissipated over time. By a quarter century later, in 1915, one Dr. W.P. Cawwood and a Dr. E.M. Howard would end up building a two-story shared office building on the corner of 2nd and Mound Streets in Harlan. Over time, Turners, Howards, Cawwoods, and Lewises have all intermarried. And for all the fame of other feuds in the Kentucky area, the Hatfields and McCoys along the West Virginia border being the most notable, few people, even locally, remember who anybody like Devil Jim Turner or Wills Howard or George Turner or Will Jennings were. The feud has largely slipped into myth and is shrouded and seldom talked about. People usually talk about things like the Harlan County War during the coal mining uprisings and such, which are themselves very interesting passages in the region's history, but those have eclipsed, having happened so soon after this feud, most of the feud violence, and most of the feud has been largely forgotten even by the locals. The whole episode is illustrative of the self-reliant willingness to resort to radical measures to protect your way of life and your family, your security, to solve your own problems that is so characteristic of the region. When I was much younger, I would ride as a boy along with my grandfather, who was a hospital courier, on 4-hour shifts where he would be driving pathology samples and other things like that, from x-rays from outlet to outlet locally. And the rides themselves were always scored by bluegrass music. And one of his favorite groups were the Osborne Brothers, and anybody familiar with Tennessee sports or with bluegrass in general will probably be aware of the song Rocky Top, which got played a lot on the stations he'd listened to. And until years later, revisiting the song, I had never noticed there's a throwaway line in the song that really strikes home with the story that's just been related. The song itself, Rocky Top, is a exaltation, a celebration of simple living, of rural life. The song is studded with positive reinforcements about Rocky Top, Tennessee, the place that the song is about. And it ends with this couple of passages that the singer himself has been cramped up, living the city life, and he longs for things to be simple again. So it's a very jaunty, positive celebration of Appalachian existence. But in the middle of that song, there are two throwaway verses that go, "Once two strangers climbed old Rocky Top looking for a moonshine still. Strangers ain't come down from Rocky Top, reckon they never will." And as I say, these two lines are couched within a song which is entirely upbeat. It's entirely positive. But they imply the deadly serious encounter with, say, prohibition officers or just snooping outsiders who have threatened the way of life of whatever family is operating still and then been done away with. And that threat, that willingness to defend what you have, what allows you and your family and your community to subsist, to continue to thrive, with violence if necessary, is what has left the whole region studded with these excellent legends of outlaws and feudists and gunfighters.